Okay, in part two of these video series on ASAD models, part two we're going to look at gaps that can form. So let's start with here we're going to call the first type of gap that we'll talk about is a recessionary gap. And so let's start with that. So with the recessionary gap, we have AD and SRAS. And you'll see that the intersection point, we'll call point A, is not aligned with long-run aggregate supply. Now, what we know is that as we move from full employment toward zero, that we're going to see increasing levels of unemployment. And that's what we've got here. So we're at Y1 and our price level is PL1. So this gap between Y1 and YF is a recessionary gap. So what can we say about it? Well, we can say we've got high levels of unemployment. We've got typically low levels of GDP growth. And it's quite likely that we have either low levels of inflation or even deflation can occur with this situation. So these are the symptoms, and this is of a recessionary gap, and here's what it looks like. The next gap down below we're going to call an inflationary gap. So with an inflationary gap, whoops, let me so we've got AD, SRAS, and here what we've got is we're beyond full employment. So the gap looks like this. Here's your gap, and we're now at point B. So what can we say about point B? Well, we're going to be experiencing low levels of unemployment, and the main problem is going to be high levels of inflation, because what's happening is with almost everyone having jobs, it's going to be difficult for firms to find potential employees. So they quite often will end up poaching employees from other firms, and that drives up price level. It makes production more expensive. But okay, so then we should also be seeing high levels of GDP growth. So that's point B. Okay, so let's just to kind of help us make sense of all this, let me shrink that a little bit, and we're going to go with one more graph. We're going to call this the business cycle. Oops, let me do that in blue. So on the horizontal axis, we've got time. On the vertical axis, we've got real GDP. And our GDP trend line should show, and this is also known as potential GDP, should show GDP growth of about 2% a year, which is at this point considered about where the United States is. So this growth rate, I'm just going to put 2% growth. And at any point in time, we're going to be somewhere along that line. But what happens in reality is that we tend to cycle. So we tend to do this. Now, the actual curve then is real GDP. Okay, so we've got here we've got peaks, and then we also have a trough. And recessions tend to be down along, let's see, along, let's see if I got this curve. There's your recession. As we go from peak toward trough, we end up in a recession. And it's particularly bad when we get below the potential GDP. So in this area down here is where we're going to see recessionary gaps. Now, they could be forming as we go from peak back to potential GDP, so along this stretch, but they're going to really develop and take off when we're in the trough. Now, when we go from trough toward peak, that's when we tend to develop inflationary gaps, and particularly pronounced when we get above potential GDP, so from this point up. So point A, if we were going to draw or sort of correlate point A on the LRAS curve up above would be somewhere, I'm going to put it right here. We're going to call that point A. And that correlates with point A up here. So this point A and this point A are the same. Then we've got point B would be, let's say, about right there. So again, this point B correlates with this point B. Okay, so that's what the gaps look like in the ASAD model. In part 3, we're going to look at how do we solve the problem using classical theory on the one hand and Keynesian theories on the other. That's it.